Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I know you use this video to fall asleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what city are you watching? I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, let's dive in. The rain hammered against the glass canopy of Central Station with the persistence of desperate fingers. Sarah Chen pulled her coat tighter and checked her phone for the third time in as many minutes. 11:47 p.m. The last train to Millbrook was due any moment, assuming the weather hadn't delayed it further. She'd been chasing this story for 3 weeks now. Reports of a phantom train that appeared on the old Millbrook line, carrying passengers who were never seen again. Urban legend bullshit, most likely, but her editor at the Tribune was desperate for Halloween content, and Sarah needed the byline. Her investigative pieces on city corruption had been gaining traction, but bills didn't pay themselves on principles alone. The station felt unnaturally quiet for a Friday night. Even accounting for the late hour and miserable weather, she'd expected to see more people. The few scattered passengers huddled in the waiting areas looked like ghosts themselves, pale, drawn faces illuminated by the sickly fluorescent lighting. A metallic screech echoed through the vast terminal. Sarah looked up at the departure board, watching as train after train switched to "canceled" in red letters, all except one. 11:52 p.m., Platform 13, Millbrook Local, on time, Platform 13. Sarah frowned. She'd been riding these rails for years during her college commute, and she could have sworn there were only 12 platforms. But there it was on the board, clear as day. She shouldered her laptop bag and made her way through the terminal. The crowds thinned as she walked until she found herself alone in a dimly lit corridor she didn't remember seeing before. The walls were older here, with peeling paint and water stains that formed abstract patterns in the overhead lighting. Platform 13 stretched before her like a concrete tongue licking at the darkness beyond. A single bench sat beneath a flickering light, and the digital display showed the same information. 11:52 p.m., Millbrook Local, on time. Sarah checked her phone again. 11:51, right on schedule, assuming the schedule made any sense. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded her of flowers left too long in a vase. A distant rumble grew closer, accompanied by the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails. Light pierced the tunnel's mouth, growing brighter with each passing second. The train that emerged looked wrong somehow. Not obviously so. It was clearly a modern commuter rail car, sleek and white with the familiar blue stripe of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, but something about its proportions seemed off, as if she were seeing it through water or thick glass. The train glided to a stop with barely a whisper. No hydraulic hiss of brakes, no squeal of metal on metal. Just silence, broken only by the soft pneumatic sigh of opening doors. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away, to catch a cab or wait until morning. But those same instincts had kept her from breaking the City Hall story last year, and she'd watched a competitor take the credit instead. Sometimes you had to push through the fear to get the truth. She stepped aboard. The interior of the train car felt larger than it should have, stretching back further than the external dimensions could possibly allow. The lighting was softer here, emanating from panels in the ceiling that gave off a warm, almost golden glow. It should have been comforting, but instead it made Sarah's skin crawl. She wasn't alone. Scattered throughout the car were perhaps a dozen other passengers, each sitting alone and staring straight ahead. They were dressed in clothes that spanned decades. A woman in a 1950s dress with white gloves, a man in a disco-era leisure suit, a teenager in grunge flannel that looked authentically worn rather than vintage store distressed. None of them acknowledged her presence as she made her way down the aisle. They didn't even seem to be breathing. Sarah chose a seat halfway down the car, close enough to observe the other passengers but far enough from any of them to feel somewhat secure. She pulled out her phone to take notes, but the screen remained black no matter how many times she pressed the power button. Dead battery, apparently, though she could have sworn it was at 60% when she'd checked it on the platform. The doors slid shut with that same pneumatic whisper, and the train began to move. No jolt or gradual acceleration. One moment they were stationary, the next they were gliding through the tunnel at what felt like an impossible speed. The lights outside the windows weren't the familiar glow of the subway system, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to pulse and writhe in the darkness. "Tickets, please." Sarah jumped. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but now a conductor stood in the aisle beside her seat. He was tall and thin, wearing a traditional black uniform with brass buttons that caught the golden light. His face was sharp and angular, with pale skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too white and too sharp. I don't have a ticket," Sarah stammered. "I was told I could pay on board." The conductor's smile widened. "Of course you can. The question is, what are you willing to pay?" Before Sarah could ask what he meant, he had moved on to the next passenger, the woman in the 1950s dress. The woman reached into her purse with mechanical precision and withdrew what looked like a photograph. The conductor examined it, nodded, and punched a hole in it with a silver ticket punch. The woman's face flickered for a moment, becoming translucent, before solidifying again. Sarah watched in growing horror as the conductor moved from passenger to passenger. Each one handed over something different. Photographs, letters, what looked like jewelry or personal mementos. With each transaction, the passengers seemed to fade slightly, becoming less substantial. When the conductor reached the teenager in flannel, the boy looked up with hollow eyes and shook his head. "I don't have anything left," he whispered. The conductor's expression didn't change. "Then you know what that means." The boy nodded and stood. He walked to the rear of the car, opened a door that Sarah was certain hadn't been there before, and stepped through. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and when Sarah blinked, his seat was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that suggested no one had ever sat there at all. The conductor was approaching her again, that terrible smile never wavering. "Now then," he said, his voice like silk over broken glass. "What do you have for me?" Sarah's mind raced. Around her, the remaining passengers sat in their eerie silence, some more translucent than others, all staring ahead with those hollow, empty eyes. Outside the windows, the pulsing lights had given way to complete darkness. Not the darkness of tunnels, but the absolute black of deep space. "I don't understand," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "This is just a train. I just need to get to Millbrook." The conductor tilted his head, and Sarah noticed that his neck bent at an angle that seemed anatomically impossible. "Millbrook? Oh my dear, this train doesn't go to Millbrook. It never has." But the sign said, "Signs say many things. The question is, do you believe everything you read?" His laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane. "You're a journalist, aren't you? Sarah Chen of the Tribune. I've been expecting you." The temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah's breath misted in front of her face. "How do you know my name?" "I know all my passengers. I know why they board, what they're looking for, what they're running from." He leaned closer, and she could smell something like copper pennies and old roses on his breath. "You're looking for a story. The phantom train, the missing passengers. Well, congratulations. You found it." Sarah stood abruptly, pushing past the conductor toward the front of the car. "I want off. Stop the train. I want off right now." But when she reached the door she'd entered through, it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed. Through the small window, she could see only that endless darkness rushing past. "I'm afraid that's not how this works," the conductor said from behind her. He hadn't moved from where she'd left him, but somehow his voice was right in her ear. "You boarded of your own free will. Now you're part of the journey." What journey? Where does this train go? To the last stop, of course, the final destination for everyone aboard. He gestured to the other passengers, and Sarah saw that several more seats had become empty while she wasn't looking. "But first, you need to pay your fare." Sarah backed away from the door, her shoulders hitting the wall of the train car. The metal was cold against her skin, cold enough to burn. "I don't have any money with me. My wallet's back at—" "Money?" The conductor laughed again, that horrible wind chime sound. "What use would I have for money? No, the fare is much more personal than that. A memory, a moment, something that makes you, you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the silver ticket punch. In the golden light, it looked less like a tool and more like a surgical instrument, with sharp edges that seemed to bend light around them. "I've found that journalists carry the most interest in memories. All those stories, all those experiences, the first byline, the biggest scoop, the story that got away." His eyes, when had they become so dark, fixed on hers? "What will it be, Sarah? What memory are you willing to trade for passage?" Sarah's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Ghost trains were urban legends, stories told to scare tourists and sell newspapers. She was a rational person, a skeptic by training and temperament, but the evidence of her senses was undeniable. "And if I refuse?" The conductor glanced toward the back of the car where the teenager had disappeared. "Well, you saw what happened to the young man. Some passengers run out of fare before they reach their destination. They have to disembark early." "Into what? There's nothing out there." "Exactly." The train shuddered suddenly, and Sarah felt a change in the rhythm of the wheels on the tracks. They were slowing down. Through the windows, she could see the faint outline of what looked like a station platform approaching, but not any station she recognized. The platform stretched impossibly far in both directions, and the few visible fixtures seemed to be made of bone or some other organic material. "First stop," the conductor announced cheerfully. "Who's getting off here?" The woman in the 1950s dress stood with mechanical precision. She was barely more than a shadow now, her form wavering like heat shimmer. She walked to the door, which opened at her approach, and stepped onto the platform. In the brief moment before the door closed, Sarah heard something that might have been screaming, though it was too distant and distorted to be sure. The train began to move again, accelerating back into that endless darkness. "She'd been riding for quite some time," the conductor explained conversationally. "Gave me her wedding day during the Roosevelt administration. Then her children's births during the Eisenhower years. Tonight was her last memory, learning to drive in 1962. Nothing left to trade." Sarah's legs gave out and she collapsed back into her seat. This is insane. This is impossible. Sanity is a luxury you can't afford here, the conductor said, and possibility is a much more flexible concept than most people realize. Now, shall we discuss your fare? The conductor's pale hand hovered over Sarah's shoulder, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his skin. The silver ticket punch gleamed in his other hand, catching and reflecting the golden light in ways that hurt to look at directly. "I can see your memories, you know," he said softly. "They shine like little lights in the darkness, some bright, some dim, all of them precious in their own way." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out his voice, but it seemed to come from inside her skull now. "This isn't real. I'm having some kind of breakdown. I'm still on the platform, passed out from exhaustion." "Reality is what you experience, my dear, and right now, you're experiencing this." She felt, rather than saw him lean closer. "There's a particularly bright memory here. Your first published article. You were 22, fresh out of journalism school, a piece about homeless veterans that took you 3 months to research. You remember the feeling when you saw your byline in print for the first time?" The memory blazed to life unbidden. The newsroom at 6 a.m., buying the first copy off the truck, seeing her name in black and white. The pride, the validation, the sense that she was finally becoming the person she'd always wanted to be. "No," she whispered. "It's a beautiful memory," the conductor continued, "so full of hope and possibility. I could take just that one and you'd still have decades of experiences left. You'd hardly miss it." But Sarah knew he was lying. Somehow, she understood that the memories weren't just taken. They were devoured, leaving not just the absence of the experience but a void where the experience had been. Take away her first published article, and the career that followed would become meaningless, a series of actions without context or motivation. She opened her eyes and looked around the car. The remaining passengers sat in their eerie silence, but now she could see them differently. The man in the leisure suit was missing his left hand. Not cut off, but simply absent, as if it had never existed. The hand he'd traded away, perhaps, along with whatever memory was attached to it. A woman near the front had no reflection in the window beside her. Another passenger flickered in and out of visibility with each breath. They were all incomplete, puzzle pieces with crucial sections missing, and with each fare they paid, they became less human, less real, until finally there was nothing left to sustain them, and they stepped off into the void. "I won't do it," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "I won't pay your fare." The conductor's smile faltered for the first time since she'd boarded. "Everyone pays, eventually. The train has a way of encouraging cooperation." As if summoned by his words, the car began to change. The golden light flickered and dimmed, revealing shadows that moved independently of their sources. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and Sarah could swear she heard something scratching inside them. Fingernails on metal, desperate and endless. The temperature dropped further, and frost began to form on the windows. The other passengers turned to look at her for the first time since she'd boarded, their hollow eyes reflecting nothing but hunger. "You feel it now, don't you?" the conductor whispered. "The weight of this place, the hunger. It feeds on what makes you human, and it's been starving. You can resist for a while, but eventually the cold and the dark and the endless motion will wear you down. You'll beg me to take your memories just to make it stop." Sarah stood up, fighting against the growing cold that seemed to be seeping into her bones. She had to think, had to find a way out of this nightmare. There had to be rules, some kind of logic to this supernatural economics. Ghosts and spirits and folklore always followed rules, even if those rules were twisted and cruel. "What are you?" she asked. "What is this place?" The conductor straightened, and for a moment his human facade slipped. Sarah caught a glimpse of something vast and terrible underneath. Not evil in any human sense, but alien and hungry in a way that made her mind recoil. "I am the ferryman of the forgotten," he said. "This train travels the spaces between spaces, collecting the lost and the seeking. Every city has its phantom railways, its ghost roads, its vessels that sail between what is and what was. We provide a service, you see, a way for the living to reach the places the living cannot go. By stealing their memories, by accepting payment for passage. The dead have no use for the memories of the living, but the living." He smiled that terrible smile again. The living always want to go where they don't belong. The train shuddered again, and through the windows Sarah could see another station approaching. This one looked more familiar. Covered platforms, modern fixtures, even what looked like vending machines. But the people waiting on the platform stood too still, their faces too pale in the artificial light. "Second stop," the conductor announced. "Anyone for Purgatory Junction?" 2 more passengers stood, the man in the leisure suit and an elderly woman Sarah hadn't noticed before. They moved with the same mechanical precision as the 1950s woman, walking to the door without looking back. The door opened onto the platform and Sarah heard that distant screaming again, though now it sounded less like pain and more like relief. The door closed and they were moving again. "They chose to get off," Sarah said, more to herself than to the conductor. "Of course they did. Free will is sacred, even here. I cannot take what is not freely given, and I cannot force anyone to remain who truly wishes to leave." His eyes glittered with predatory amusement. "But I can make the alternative very, very unpleasant." The car was nearly empty now. Only 3 passengers remained besides Sarah, a middle-aged man in a rumpled business suit, a young woman with tear-streaked makeup, and an old man who might have been sleeping if not for the fact that his chest wasn't moving. Sarah studied the conductor as he moved among the remaining passengers, collecting memories like a twisted version of a traditional ticket taker. There had to be a way out, some loophole in whatever supernatural contract governed this nightmare train. Every system had vulnerabilities, even systems that operated outside the normal laws of physics. "You said you know all your passengers," she said suddenly. "You knew I was coming. How?" The conductor paused in his examination of the business suit man's offerings, what looked like a child's drawing. "The train calls to those who are searching for stories they shouldn't find. Journalists, investigators, the morbidly curious. You answered the call when you stepped onto Platform 13. But Platform 13 doesn't exist. It exists when it needs to, when someone is looking for something that doesn't want to be found." He punched a hole in the child's drawing, and the business suit man's face went slack, his eyes becoming as hollow as the others. "Your story about the phantom train, for instance. Most people would dismiss such reports as urban legend, but you came looking anyway." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold permeating the car. The missing people, the passengers who supposedly vanished, they were all like me, weren't they? Investigators, journalists, people trying to solve the mystery. The conductor's smile was answer enough. "How many?" she pressed. How many people have boarded this train looking for a story? Oh, dozens over the years. Perhaps hundreds. Time moves differently here, you understand. What seems like decades to you might be moments to me, or vice versa. He gestured to the empty seats around them. They all found their story in the end. They became part of it. The young woman with tear-streaked makeup stood and walked to the back of the car. Unlike the others, she looked directly at Sarah as she passed, her lips moving silently. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the expression on the woman's face was clear. Don't let him win. The door at the back of the car opened. Sarah still couldn't figure out how it appeared and disappeared, and the woman stepped through. But this time, Sarah was ready. In the brief moment before the door closed, she caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. It wasn't the void she'd expected. It was somewhere else. Another train car, older and more decrepit than this one, filled with shadows that might have been people. And beyond that, the suggestion of other cars, other spaces, stretching back like an infinite series of Russian dolls. "Curious, aren't you?" the conductor said, noticing her attention. "That's what got you into this mess in the first place." But Sarah was beginning to understand. The train wasn't just a vehicle. It was a system, a network of connected spaces and experiences. The passengers weren't disappearing into nothingness. They were being moved deeper into the system, further from the reality they'd known. "You're not just collecting fares," she said slowly. "You're building something. All these memories, all these people, they're components in some kind of, what? Engine? Power source?" The conductor's expression shifted, and for the first time Sarah saw something like respect in his inhuman eyes. "Very good. Most passengers never think to ask about the bigger picture. They're too focused on their own survival. So, what happens when you have enough? When you've collected enough memories and passengers and stories? Then we reach the final stop, of course, the place where all stories end." He leaned back against one of the seats, suddenly looking less like a supernatural entity and more like a tired civil servant. "Though, between you and me, I sometimes wonder if that stop actually exists, or if we're all just traveling." The admission was so unexpected, so human, that Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You don't know, do you?" she said. "You don't know where this train is actually going. You're as trapped as the rest of us." The conductor's facade cracked completely, revealing something desperate underneath. "I collect the fares. I maintain order. I follow the rules. That's all I know how to do. That's all I've ever known how to do." "How long have you been doing this?" I don't remember. The train was here, the passengers were here, and I was here. It's what I do. It's what I am." Sarah stood up, her journalist's instincts finally overriding her fear. This was the story. Not just the phantom train or the missing passengers, but the tragedy of a system that had lost its purpose and continued operating on momentum alone. "What if I could offer you something better than memories?" she said. The conductor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if, instead of taking pieces of the past, I could give you a future?" The train was slowing again, and through the windows Sarah could see lights approaching. Not the sickly glow of the previous stations, but warm, golden illumination that reminded her of sunrise. The platform that came into view looked different too. Clean, modern, with benches and digital displays that actually seemed to show real information. But Sarah barely noticed the scenery. Her attention was focused on the conductor, who was staring at her with an expression of desperate hope and terrible fear. A future, he repeated slowly. I don't understand. You said you don't remember how long you've been doing this, or how it started. What if that's because you're not supposed to be doing it forever? What if there's supposed to be an end? The last remaining passenger, the old man who might have been sleeping, stood and walked toward the door, but instead of the mechanical precision of the others, his movements were smooth, natural. He paused beside Sarah's seat and looked down at her with eyes that were clear and aware. "Thank you," he said simply, and stepped off the train. Sarah watched through the window as he walked across the platform toward what looked like a normal subway exit. There were other people there. Real people, she thought, with color in their cheeks and life in their movements. The old man joined them and disappeared into the crowd. "He didn't pay," Sarah said. The conductor was staring after the departed passenger with an expression of wonder. "No, he didn't. But he's been riding longer than anyone. Decades, at least. He should have run out of memories long ago." Maybe he did. Maybe he paid everything he had, and that freed him somehow. The train began to move again, but something was different. The motion felt less smooth, less inevitable. The golden light in the car flickered, and for a moment Sarah could see cracks in the walls. Not damage, but seams, as if the entire space was constructed from pieces that had been fitted together. The system is breaking down, she realized. How long since someone got off at a normal stop? How long since a passenger actually reached a destination instead of just disappearing? The conductor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't remember. Maybe there never was a final destination. Maybe we've just been riding in circles, collecting and consuming, because that's all we knew how to do." Sarah pulled out her phone. Still dead, but she tried anyway. Nothing. But wait. There was something in her jacket pocket that hadn't been there before. A small notebook, the kind she always carried but had forgotten about in the chaos of boarding the train. The pages were blank except for one line written in her own handwriting. "Every story needs an ending." She didn't remember writing it, but somehow she knew it was important. "What if the future I'm offering isn't just for you?" she said. "What if it's for all of us? Every passenger who ever boarded this train, every memory you've collected, every story that's been trapped here." The conductor looked at her with growing understanding. "You want to end it, the whole system. I want to finish it. There's a difference." Sarah stood up, feeling more confident than she had since boarding. Stories don't end when they stop. They end when they're complete, when they've said what they came to say. The train was accelerating now, faster than ever before. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, but Sarah had the sense that they were approaching something vast and significant. The car shuddered and groaned as if struggling against some enormous pressure. "Final stop," the conductor said, but his voice was different now. Less theatrical, more human. "All passengers must disembark." The door at the front of the car opened, revealing not another platform but something else entirely. Light, not the golden glow of the car's interior or the sickly fluorescence of the earlier stations, but natural light. Sunlight. Through the doorway, Sarah could see what looked like a newsroom. Her newsroom, in fact, though it was different somehow, brighter, more alive, filled with the energy of stories being born rather than consumed. "Is that real?" she asked. The conductor smiled, and for the first time it looked genuine. "It's as real as any story that needs to be told." Sarah walked toward the door, then paused. "What about you? what happens to you when the system ends. I don't know, he admitted, but for the first time in however long it's been, I'm curious to find out. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the notebook. Without really thinking about it, she tore out the page with the single line of her handwriting and handed it to him. "You're fair," she said. He took the paper and read the words aloud. "Every story needs an ending." Then he looked up at her with something like gratitude. "Thank you." The silver ticket punch appeared in his hand one last time, but instead of punching a hole in the paper, he carefully folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket. "I think," he said, "I'll keep this one." Sarah woke up at her desk in the Tribune newsroom, her head pillowed on her arms and her laptop humming softly beside her. Pale morning light filtered through the tall windows, and the familiar sounds of the city awakening drifted up from the street below. She sat up slowly, her neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages. Apparently, she'd been unreachable since leaving the office the previous evening. The timestamp showed 6:47 a.m. Saturday. Her laptop screen displayed a document she didn't remember creating. A story about phantom trains and missing passengers, complete with interviews and research she'd never conducted. At the bottom of the document was a byline that made her heart skip. By Sarah Chen and the conductor. She scrolled to the top and began to read. The last stop, an investigation into the Metropolitan Transit Authority's lost line. For decades, reports have circulated about a phantom train that appears on the MTA's unused tracks, carrying passengers to destinations that don't exist. This reporter investigated these claims and discovered something far more complex than simple urban legend. The story was perfect, well-researched, compelling, and completely factual in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It detailed the history of discontinued rail lines, interviewed family members of missing persons, and presented a coherent theory about how urban infrastructure could become detached from its original purpose. But it was the ending that took her breath away. In the end, we found that some journeys are meant to teach us about the destination, while others are meant to teach us about the journey itself. The phantom train of Platform 13 no longer runs. Its final passenger helped it reach the one destination that had always eluded it, a proper ending to its story. If you find yourself on a platform that shouldn't exist, boarding a train that doesn't appear on any schedule, remember, every story needs an ending, but it's up to us to write it. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached the final paragraph. Special thanks to my collaborator on this piece, who wishes to be known only as the conductor. After years of collecting stories, he has decided to try creating them instead. He can be reached at the Metropolitan Transit Authority's new creative writing workshop for displaced rail personnel, which holds its meetings every Friday at 11:52 p.m. on Platform 12. Some stories end. Some stories begin. The best stories do both. Sarah saved the document and sent it to her editor with a note. Halloween special. Trust me on this one. Then she packed up her laptop, put on her coat, and walked to the window. Far below, she could see commuters hurrying to catch their morning trains, each one carrying their own stories, their own destinations, their own possibilities. Somewhere in the city, she knew, there was a former conductor learning to write his own stories instead of collecting others. And somewhere else, there were people who had been missing for years, decades even, finding their way back to the lives they'd left behind. She had work to do. There were always more stories to chase, more truths to uncover. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she wasn't just pursuing stories anymore. She was living one, and it was far from over.